this is Deepal Parekh with Dr. Wagner and Ravi Brambert. We are former students of Dr. Wagner from University of Houston Clear Lake, and we are having a conversation about leadership and ethics. Today's focus is on taking on the big challenge of school and district administration. So, Dr. Wagner, what are your thoughts on leadership, management, and the policy making?
Well, we often talk as though the superintendent or a state secretary of education, whatever it might be, is a leader, a manager, a researcher, and a policymaker. The fact of the matter is, it's very rare that one person has all those talents in them. And so managing, for example, is quite different than policymaking. Policymaking, you've envisioned what you would like to have come about, and you've somehow matched it up with a future that you imagine would be good in some sense. And the manager then is given the job of taking a look at that vision and certain parameters for how to get there. And then they've got to plug in the details to make sure that we're moving along in that direction. Contrast the researcher, their job is to say, all right, I see where you started and I see what you're aiming at, and I'm going to track how close you're coming to your goals or your objectives. The goal, I should say objectives more than goals. Your goals are your ideals. Your objectives are the specifics that if those objectives are realized, then your goals will be fulfilled. So goals and objectives are different. And leaders have to be focused primarily on goals, the ideals, and they usually have managers working under them whose job it is to see to it that the organization is making progress toward the respective objectives of their area of management.
So the leadership and management, are they exclusive functions of education?
Well, you have management and leadership going on in any organization. You even have management and leadership going on in an operating room in a hospital. The head surgeon is said to be the leader because he knows how to what it is that he's going in after and how to remove it or change it. But you have an anesthesiologist who is in there to keep the patient pain-free if possible. And the anesthesiologist is managing the patient's oxygen intake. They're managing the biochemistry of the machinery that's putting the relaxing chemical into the patient. And they let the surgeon know if there are any problems arising with the administration of the anesthesia. But the surgeon is both the leader and, if you will, the policymaker of what goes on in there. And in today's operating rooms, there's also people besides nurses and orderlies that are taking care of the things you would expect them to be taking care of. There's usually some kind of an engineer involved, because if you've ever taken a look at a modern surgical facility these days, there is so much technology in there. And there's no way that even the surgeon can know how that stuff works. And so there's usually somebody who is an engineer of some sort who is standing by should anything go wrong with some of the equipment, is able to hopefully adjust things in the equipment, or somebody pull out a plug by accident, notice that that plug has been pulled out, put it back in. So they're managing the equipment that the surgeon is depending upon, and the anesthesiologist is depending upon, and so on. So in any school administration, the one of the most important people at the district level is somebody who is running the finances for the school. And oftentimes one of the best people you can get for that job is an MBA. and some universities like Rice University offers a combined MBA program in educational management. And so what you get there is somebody who should be pretty good with passing the numbers. But I'd be reluctant to want to have an MBA be in charge of a school district, because the ideal of the school district is to create that great conversation of humankind that makes critical thinkers out of the students and sends them into the future prepared to ask questions like, how do you know, and how ought I to treat other people, and so on and so forth. And that has not been the training of the MBA. On the other hand, the senior leader at a school, who may be the superintendent and so on, we would hope, um, may not be particularly good at managing the budget. But he should have somebody who is good at managing the budget working for him. Also, the superintendent may not be the best person to do research on the statistics that are relevant to how well are we meeting individual objectives, but he should be able to hire somebody who is good at that and keep him well informed on how close are different units getting to where we want them to be in managing their objectives. Meanwhile, the leader is there, the superintendent is there, to see to it that those objectives all flow into and support the goals that eventually result in our students becoming lifetime participants in the great conversation of humankind.
I was gonna bring that up a little later, the great conversation concept, and then so what you just said about the school. What about the total quality management? Because that plays a role in there too, right? In the school
Right,
leadership.
right. Public quality management is very interesting. The people that started it were people like Philip Crosby, Florian Jordan, but the big name that everyone associates with the concept of total quality management is a fellow who was a physicist by training, and that was W.E. Deming. And when Japan was having all sorts of trouble getting its um, industrials to where they were turning out quality products, it used to be that something made in Japan was looked down upon. And Deming, an American physicist, went over there and worked with companies like Toyota and Honda and so on. The result was that Japanese car makers and Japanese electronic makers started cranking out materials that were incredibly reliable. And he computerized a lot of the work that was being done in Japan. And everyone thought this is just amazing. The quality control that this physicist has imposed upon Japanese business has revolutionized Japanese business. And they became one of the 5 economic powers in the world. And Deming was lured back into the United States and corporate types throughout the United States to tell us how to make our companies as rigorously modeled as they have in Japan. And we even asked him to help us out in education. But one of the things that Deming pointed out, and he said, for these things to work out, you have to recognize that some of what Japan has that has made them so successful is a sense of personal commitment and honor to the organization. And one of the things that, as I thought about what Deming was saying, I looked a little bit into Japanese history. And one of the things we found that illustrates what he was talking about, unlike in the United States, where when something goes wrong in an organization, and it seems like the people at the top very quickly start looking down to somebody that can be blamed for what went wrong. So the guy at the very top wants to blame one of his assistant superintendents. The assistant superintendent wants to blame a principal. A principal wants to blame an assistant principal. Assistant principal wants to blame a teacher. A teacher wants to blame a janitor. And it just keeps on going downhill. until you get so far down, the guy at the very bottom can't blame anyone else. He's at the very bottom. Well, in Japan, it was very different. And an episode in World War II illustrates that. In World War II, the Japanese, when they were about to lose the war, created these flying bombs, and they took their best pilots. It was like their Air Force Academy trainees, and they would fly these flying bombs. The idea was that they would fly them into the American Armada that was approaching Japan to slow down the American Armada so that Japan could rebuild itself. Many of its industries were made ammunition and so on were had been blown apart, and so they were in trouble. Well, these flying bombs were put in a big bomber, and then the planes would be flown toward the American Armada. The pilot of the flying bomb, a kamikaze pilot, would find himself being dropped from the big plane, and then he was to fly right through the middle of all the shots being made toward him, and then hopefully hit, if not an aircraft carrier, a big battleship, and blow it apart and sink it. Well, the very best pilots in Japan were the ones that had been selected. And we know from their diaries, in a wonderful book called The Thunder Gods, we know from their diaries how they saw what they were doing was very noble, that they were sacrificing their life so that Japan could rebuild. They are not the kamikaze pilots that we so often hear about toward the very end of the war, where they were given a lot of alcohol and they were given prostitutes to entertain them the night before they went out on these flights. The original kamikaze pilots were heroes by anyone's definition. And we know about the very first flight of these pilots that were sent up to go toward American Armada. 5 bombers, big bombers, carrying these flying bombs beneath them. They took off from an airfield in Japan and into some troublesome weather. Well, as the 5th plane was about to take off, it had come across certain uh, problems with its mechanical things, and so it never left the ground. At the end of the runway, it just stopped. The 4 planes then take off, and they head into the troublesome weather to search out the American Armada and attack it. And one of the things that we find out is that, and we find this out from their journals afterwards, the 4 bombers that went looking for the American Armada got lost up in the bad storms and so on and never found the American Armada. They lost one of their planes in the clouds, never returned. The other 3 planes returned. Kamikaze pilot still in his flying bomb underneath the big bombers, and they returned to the base. Well, the head of the Air Force Base in Japan immediately had the pilots of those 3 planes, the kamikaze pilots, and the pilots of the plane that carried it, as well as the pilot of the bomber that never took off and that kamikaze pilot. He had them all put under house arrest. Now, the reason for doing that wasn't to punish them. The reason for doing that is he was convinced that their sense of honor and pride in carrying out the mission that had been assigned to them was so great that they would figure that they had dishonored Japan, they had failed in their mission, and they would think that they needed to take the blame on themselves for the failure of this mission, and they would commit something that was called hara-kiri, to suicide. And that was why they were put under house arrest, because the commander didn't want them committing hara-kiri because what had gone wrong was not their fault. After these pilots were all in house arrest, the base commander committed hara-kiri. Because as the person at the top, it's his responsibility for carrying out the mission and not for any of the fellows down below. Well, that's pretty informative about the Japanese attitude toward honor and carrying through with the mission. So Deming, when he talks to American corporations, he says you need to have in your workforce an attitude that hasn't been common in the American workforce. And so he came up with his, I forget, it was 13 points or 15 points that you needed to have uh, total quality management work. It isn't just a matter of using the statistics to see how well quality control is working. You needed to have principles that told the workforce this is what we need to have a proper workforce in this organization or in the school. Three of those are explicitly moral principles. One of the principles that is in total quality management that Deming had was drive out fear. And his point then is that when people are afraid of losing their job or being reprimanded or sanctioned in some way, they're far less likely to stay focused on how to get the job done. Instead, their focus is on how do I cover my behind if something goes wrong. That doesn't make for good employees. It doesn't make for a good workforce. It doesn't make for people who will follow a leader. It tends to make for people who just follow along with. Another principle that he made was you shouldn't be collecting data on as many data points that you can, because when you try to collect so much data, none of it means anything. And so what you should do is focus on those data points that matter. He warns us that people tend to be very good at demonstrating the numbers you ask them to demonstrate. By hook or by crook, they will deliver the numbers. So as a leader, a policymaker, you better be darn good at picking out what numbers you should really be watching for, because those are the numbers you're going to get delivered to you. And if those aren't the right numbers, your organization can collapse and go badly, even though the numbers are telling you things are going swell. An example Deming uses within a corporation. Imagine you have a corporation that makes widgets and you have a behavioral reward system for every unit in the factory that pays off a certain amount of productivity each week or each month or whatever. Well, let's say one of those units is incredibly successful and they start cranking out these widget components far faster than the rest of the people in the factory can utilize those components to make their widgets. Well, as a result, you can store up some of those components, because after they're sold and so on, there'll be some damage that happens out there in the customer's use of the component, and they'll say we need to have a replacement for this part of the widget. So we can store some of these components. But if that one unit keeps on cranking out so many more widget components than the rest of the factory can put together the other components that allow you to make new widgets, you're rewarding people for what may cause an economic collapse of the factory. Because we've got all these component pieces stored up in our warehouses that we'll never sell. We're rewarding our employees for making so many of them. And meanwhile, we haven't got customer bases for all this. So looking at the wrong number and rewarding the wrong sort of thing can be good for the people in that small sector, but it can destroy the organization. We find this in education when what we're rewarding people for is how well students are doing on multiple choice tests. But we have lots of evidence that's telling us that people can do well on a multiple choice test and not perform well when it comes to living up to the challenge of everyday life or some sort of workforce demand. Uh, we're testing for the wrong sort of thing. We should be testing for critical evaluation. We should be testing for how well people are clear in their explanations, how exacting people can be in carrying out a task. But instead, we're testing for something that looks like it's economically um, inexpensive and quick and easy to do. And so we have our standardized multiple choice tests. It's the wrong numbers. And our educational system is suffering as a result of that. So Deming's point, Be careful what numbers you ask for because people are good at delivering them. And the third point, too many numbers obscure what you're looking for. You've heard the old expression, you can't see the forest for the trees. And so if you have a forest full of data points, you don't know what to look for. Continuous improvement in Deming's way of thinking about things is that every few years you should be reviewing what handful of numbers you're collecting because maybe they should change. But what shouldn't change is that there's always a handful of numbers that you're looking for, not this massive display of numbers, which tends to hide what we need to be looking at if we're really to make our organizations more potent, more resilient in the face of challenges.
And that is applicable to not just in education, but any organization, profit, nonprofit, any business.
That's
It's
right.
very interesting. Um, the great conversation that you mentioned earlier, who are considered the key stakeholders of that great conversation, or who should be taking part in that great conversation?
I love this question. The answer is all of us. The great conversation is the most inclusive activity of humankind. It's when we, every one of us, come together to listen respectfully to one another, to seek for truth with one another, to try to answer that question, how ought I to treat you and others? All those questions should involve each and every one of us. Now, admittedly, some people in our world, in our country, in our state, in our neighborhood aren't participating in that question, in that great conversation of humankind. And there's likely to be two reasons why they don't participate. One is that they never learn the skills and dispositions that it takes to participate in the great conversation of humankind. And so they either feel left out or they've just excluded themselves because they just don't sense that they fit. I don't see that as being their fault. I see that as being the fault of an educational system that didn't welcome them into participation in the great conversation of humankind from the lowest grades all the way up through high school and any education they participate in after that. The other reason that they may not get involved in the great conversation of humankind is that, again, I see it as being a fault in education. We didn't develop the attitudes that are required to participate, those attitudes of respecting others, those attitudes of truly wanting to seek for truth and not just some kind of a quickie that'll get this job out of the way. If those attitudes are lacking, then you can expect that people who never acquired those attitudes will be unlikely to participate in the great conversation of humankind. It is the most multicultural of all experiences. It brings us all together to try to sort out the big questions of um, how ought we to treat one another? What's the smallest bit of matter in the universe? How big is our universe? How many galaxies are there? Uh, how do genes and amino acids and all the things that make up our physical health, how do they work? And we need everyone we can bring into those conversations to get involved and to ask tough questions and to add a bit of information here and there to advance the conversation for us all. The great conversation of humankind is what happens when education works. When education fails to work, too many people get excluded from that great conversation of humankind.
Very, very, very intense. The first time I heard the term "the great conversation" was in your class this summer, and I've spent over 18 years in education field, but I've never heard that term
Well, there had been a time when that term had been disparaged a bit. Back in the 1950s, a fellow named of Mortimer Adler, who was the editor of the Encyclopedia Britannica, also started what was called a Great Book Series. And he had clubs all over the United States where smart, important people would get together and read the selection of the 100 great texts of the great conversation of humankind. Now, he tried to be inclusive, but out of those 100 books, there were only something like 2 to 4 books that talked about things that went on beyond the Western world. And even in those 2 to 4 books, the things that they talked about were things like Confucius, Lao Tzu, important things, but they ignored, it made it seem like everything that the Far East had to offer was only of historical nature. I've got a book right here. I don't know if you can see it. It's called The Shape of a Life. It's by a Chinese mathematician who won the Fields Medal a couple of years ago. That's the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in mathematics. There are extraordinary contributions being made all around the world and have been made all around the world from different cultures. And not all contributions are equal worth, by the way. We're looking for the really good stuff. But there's really good stuff coming from different places around the world. And so when Mortimer Adler came up with his great books, it really wasn't inclusive. Another fellow by the name of Will Durant tried to talk about the history and philosophy of the world. And again, he only had a couple of books, that the first two, that brought anything up from the Mideast and from India because of mathematics and so on. A couple of things referred to Chinese work and in philosophy. But it made it sound like that stuff had stopped and that only Western European civilizations continue to contribute, which we know isn't the case. We do want to give credit to where credit is due, and for example, in the case of Nobel prizes in the sciences, they've only been given for like the last 100 years. Look at the last 50 years, and one of the things you'll see is that so many of those go to a small group of scientists, largely from Japan, China, few from Korea, and many who are Jewish, disproportionately to all the rest of the world. Give credit where credit's due. We don't have to give the same number of Nobel Prizes to Japanese physicists as we do to British physicists. But nonetheless, look at great work is being done ongoing throughout the world. And way back in the 1950s, that got overlooked, and we don't want that to happen again. So what we've done is try to take this concept, which the concept is a good concept of the great conversation of humankind, and make it what it's supposed to be, a conversation for all humans, to invite all humans into the conversation, to encourage all humans to develop the dispositions to ask those questions. How do you know? What do you mean by the term so-and-so? To ask for clarity, to develop in all humans attitudes of respect, honesty, kinds of things that make the great conversation work. Skills of reflective thinking for all humans, and not just humans in one part of the world as opposed to another. And to give information, of course, that's relevant to use these dispositions, skills, and attitudes about as we try to figure out what to do next. I'd like to think that in today's session and in the sessions that we've had in the past, that we have been, you and I have been contributing, and Ravi, because he was in session 2, have been contributing to the great conversation as we talk. Not just me, but you guys are also the co-architects of what we talk about, because you ask the questions that lead to whatever it is I might have to share.
That's very nice to know. All right. Well, Dr. Wagner, we are at 4:44. I think we reached our 30 minutes for today. But I have a question. It's not based on the conversation that we had, but it's somewhat relevant. Um, the Poor Richard's Almanac by Benjamin Franklin, right?
Right.
The information that he had in there, would you consider that like an something that ignites the great conversation? Because the stuff he had on there, it's wisdom, but it's the everyday wisdom, everyday knowledge.
Right. I think that um, hmm, the conversation is about big questions. It's not about whether or not we should be going out and having a corned beef sandwich as opposed to a burger today. That's mere conversation. Um, Poor Richard's Almanac kind of wavers between the mid ground between ordinary conversation and some big questions. Um, Benjamin Franklin had a common way of talking at times, but he often carried great wisdom in what he said. I'm reminded of when he came out of the Constitutional Convention, where the uh, founders of the United States had put together their first Constitution and had endorsed the Bill of Rights before anybody would agree to sanction the Constitution. That Bill of Rights had to be there. The first five amendments of the Bill of Rights protect you and I from everybody else, because there can be a tyranny of the majority. So the first five amendments protect you and I from everybody else. The second five amendments were to protect the states from intrusion by the federal government. Now, with this Constitution and the Bill of Rights that the founders have put together, and it was really a great piece of work. It is a great piece of work. But when Benjamin Franklin came out of the convention hall, some newspaper writers approached him and said, "Well, what kind of a government do we have?" And Benjamin Franklin said, in such a profound and simple way, he said, "We've given the people a republican form of democracy if they can keep it." Wow.
Yeah, that just brought chills.
Yeah,
Wow. What a way to end this session. Thank you.
you're welcome. Look forward to seeing you again, Paul.
Yes, sir.